Welcome to the listening party brought to you by Feel Good Series. My name is Helen Herimbi, and this party, as the name suggests, is all about listening to and gaining insight into some of the best music from a host of eclectic artists. It's my absolute pleasure today to be talking to this particular musician who always puts her best foot forward with her offerings. She is a composer, thoughtfully reflecting our interior and communal lives. She is a vocal powerhouse, and she is a consistent color queen. She is Zoë Modiga. Yay! Welcome, Zoë.
Thank you for having me here. I feel welcome, and I'm excited to having this conversation with you.
Me too. So you've just put out your second album, and it's called Inganekwane. And on the cover, you are flanked by a herd of cattle. So that makes me feel like that's probably how you grew up, right?
I think what's interesting about my childhood is that I grew up in different kinds of settings all at once, and I'm sure a lot of young Black people will actually relate to that. I was as exposed to the township life as I was to the suburban life, as I was to the life emakhaya. Yeah. So I'd visit my paternal grandmother, and that was my experience of going to the homelands, and that was my experience of cattle and cows and fresh air and clear skies and all of that. So yeah. I'm grateful to my grandmother for having opened that experience to me.
Yeah. Was your grandmother the type of woman who would tell you stories before you go to bed?
Not necessarily, actually. I found that when as I was saying, I was living in a lot of spaces all at once, but I spent a lot of my time with my maternal grandmother, Mbali Ewan in Pietermaritzburg, and the neighbors next door would actually, when we were much younger though, they would call us into one space and they would tell us Inganekwane, and that was my first experience of what that was. And it was beautiful, my particular experience or memory rather of it is this rainy, cold day and us going into her particular room while she sat all of us down and she told us all these stories. So yeah, she is so special to that memory for me.
Yeah. Did you have a particular story that was your favorite that you sometimes wanted to be told over and over again?
I found there was one that was talking about Unokwacha. Actually, a lot of them spoke about Unokwacha, the rabbit. Yes, there was one that spoke about a rabbit. But the memory of them is actually quite murky. I feel that I actually have to go back into that and find someone who can tell me these stories now. And I find that I'll have a lot of, oh yeah, that's what Unokwacha did. Yeah. But I just remember the rabbit being such a character of trickery and kind of just creating such a beautiful plot to the story, But I'm excited to revisit that and actually remember properly what those stories were and the lessons that they come with. But I will say that I remember there was always an important lesson to be told about these stories, and that's what I think makes it quite beautiful. The things that the listeners or whoever was being told, what stories and what lessons that they could relay with the stories.
Yeah. So for people who aren't from the Nguni cultures, Inganekwane is loosely translated to fairy tale, right, in isiZulu. But is it just a fairy tale or is it just a story?
I would say it's our version of a fairy tale, but I would say it's folklore.
Okay.
It's our way of telling stories to relay a particular kind of message. So it has the once upon a time and the end as a Western fairy tale does, but I think the way in which the stories are told and the different flavors that it adds is particularly different. You won't see, well, the ones I'm exposed to at least don't have a lady in a gown looking for love. It's mostly told through animals and and the habits that they're known to have, kind of revealing their nature as well, but revealing our nature through them. So, you know, it's interesting.
Yeah. So you named your second album Inganekwane. Your debut
Yeah.
album, which is the critically acclaimed, the stellar Yellow the Novel. That is the title of your debut album, Yellow the Novel. And it seems to me like there seems to be this common thread of the story. Why is the idea of story so important to you that you even put it in the title of your albums?
I think that stories are important, and I think that part of my personal purpose is to be a storyteller in some kind of way, and it really is just being inspired by the lives that we live and being able to reflect the human experience back to people. And I enjoy what that looks like, and I enjoy that it requires me to be observant. It requires me to learn more than to trust in just my own personal perspectives, even though I'll be looking at the world from my bird's eye view and my way. But it requires me to take a step back and to pay attention to be able to relay certain things, even if it's from my perspective. So I think being able to come up with Yellow the Novel kind of spoke to the self-introspection aspect, but that also did come from conversations that were being had, and a lot of it is really about self-belief and making it from a relationship, all these very common themes that we go through as human beings. And I think this particular album goes more into the idea of identity through language and storytelling, and I think that right now I could say that that's pretty much going to be the common thread between my bodies of work, just the love for telling stories, and I'm excited to see the different shapes that it takes and the different things that I get to learn along the way to be able to document and to share.
Yeah, no doubt. So the first time listeners actually get to associate your name with Inganekwane is from Yellow the Novel, because on it you have a song called Inganekwane. And
yes.
Before we talk a little bit about that particular song, I think people should actually hear it, right? It is the listening party. So we're going to play a little bit of Inganekwane and then come back with Zoe and talk about the song. That's Inganekwane of Zoë Modiga's debut album. The album is called Yellow the Novel. And Zoe, on this particular song, you say, Nansi Inganekwane, right? So it feels like you're looking at someone and you're equating them to a fairy tale. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But in that 8 minutes, it's nice. We're there. It's a fairy tale. It's great. And then you get to this part where you're like, uzosola, So tell us how you get from this fairy oh, you don't want to try me.
So I think really what is really special about that song for me is that it kind of reveals the idea of the power of language, really, and how language is attached to extreme emotion. I find personally, in my personal experience, when I feel an extreme emotion about something, I can articulate it in English, but it rings better when I speak it in my mother tongue. And for me, I think Inganekwane was really just the beginning of exploring that. Like, I was very heartbroken about a situation I've now made peace with, but at the time it brought out extreme emotion, and I couldn't write it in any other language besides my own. And it really just starts Kwasuka Sugela, once upon a time, it starts as a fairy tale because that's how relationships start off. Everything is a white picket fence, red roses, you know, ngambona wangbona sabonana, you know, we saw each other. And it quickly turns into the demise of a relationship, because my personal story was that of a demise of a relationship, and the emotions that comes with, and the yeah, you'll regret this, you know, when you're upset you say things that like are almost to kind of make the next person feel the way that you felt when the demise of the relationship happened. You're gonna regret it. You know, you're making me you're making me your plaything, you know. But I think it's very interesting to perform that song now because it's been like light years since that particular experience, and having made peace completely with it, it seems more like I suppose, a reflective story, because it relates to people, but also something of a theater piece as well, because I enjoy people getting fiery with me with that song. But yeah, that's Inganekwane, the idea of something being a fairy tale and then realizing that it isn't a fairy tale, or realizing that in fact fairy tales in real life are not the same as those that we read in books all the time.
Yeah. So, I mean, earlier you spoke about this new album being about identity and language, but you named it, it has the same title as the song that we're talking about. So what was the reasoning behind that? Because you could have named it anything else, but, you know?
There are a few reasons for that. The first reason for me was that the new album came from that song. When Inganekwane from Yellow the Novel was released, and when it was interacted with people, and when it was performed with a lot of people, and for a lot of audiences rather, there was a reaction to that song that was particularly different to other reactions to other songs. You know, there was a rootedness, a groundedness, and understanding that surpassed really even my way of interpreting it. And that song allowed a lot of listeners to alike and to compare and to be like, oh my word, this reminds me of something that I already know. This reminds me of Umambusi Mhlongo, you know. And at the time, I was actually not familiar with Mambusi Mhlongo's works. I think I only knew her by name, but I hadn't gone into that sonic discovery of her. And when I went into that, it opened such a beautiful world for me. And it was like I was being seen differently. And there was this woman who I can draw so many personal parallels to, having been known as a traveling jazz singer at some point and being told to look into expressing in a way. I'm sure jazz was a true way that she expressed herself, but she came to a crossroads where she was being challenged to look into expressing music in a more traditional kind of way. And having known that, and knowing that she was a Zulu songwriter, or that she collaborated with a lot of Zulu songwriters, kind of created space for me and affirmed me. And that, alongside other many beautiful, enriching conversations I had with so many beloved people, allowed me to get into that space of just feeling safe to writing more in my language. And that's, I suppose, how then Inganekwane happens, because it is the beginning of this album, and so it made sense to call it that. But on the other hand, it had a lot to do with the idea of a fairy tale, and the fact that fairy tales sometimes come from like mythical characters that are not real, you know. So I kind of wanted to play on that as well, like the idea of having this sophomore album written for Black bodies, even though I hope that it relates to human existence as a whole, having written it for Black bodies, and understanding that we've gone through so many traumas and so many atrocities that one would think that we are a myth, that we aren't real, you know, because we can't be real to have experienced the things that we've experienced and the things that we carry now that come from those that come before us, you know. So it was kind of that world as well of saying, we are not a myth, and this is not a very fairy tale. This is a very real story. And even when you get to the end of the album, as much as I say, it's the end, it's not the end. Very much like every fairy tale that we listen to, the lessons and the things and the conversations that we carry from that allow us to retell that story, because it's always relevant, you know. It always rings true.
Yeah, I love the two explanations you just gave, because the first one is, you know, when you're talking about Mambusi, if you think about a story, right, somebody relaying a story to you, often you insert yourself in the story. You see how you can fit into that narrative, because we all see things from our vantage point. And to know that you saw someone else's story and thought, wow, I can relate to that, I can resonate with that, and it had a positive effect on not only your music but on your life, like, is incredible. That is what story does. And then also the second thing about being these myths as Black bodies, one would think that with everything we've been through, your music would then reflect this sad, melancholy, or even like angry, but the emotions that are on the negative side of the scale. You would think that's what's happening. But this is not what the album is. This album is a range of emotions. And one of the first emotions you bring out, I would say, is joy as well, through Lengoma. So before we quiz you about Lengoma, let's hear a little bit of Lengoma. And that was Lengoma, which is a single of Zoë Modiga's brand new album. The album is called Inganekwane, and Lengoma features Dubatsi Mpho. So Zoe,
yes,
this particular song, Lengoma, tell me a little bit about where that song comes from and how it comes to you.
So with this particular song, it was actually written by Banda, who has helped to produce the entire body of work. And I remember listening to him playing the bass part, you know, and I thought it was this it just was such a grabbing, meditative bass line. And I was like, oh my goodness, I would love to write on this particular thing. I just wanted to like not help to create, but I just wanted to add my part to how I felt that sound made me feel, you know. And that's when the idea of Sila Siphilela Lengoma came through. We were actually jamming it together, and it started pouring out as this like meditative kind of messaging of us being here for this song, but also us being here for the healing of the song, you know. And I loved how the bass line had this repetitive thing that I could kind of draw back to even a nostalgia of African music and how we're able to use repetition to reinforce something, you know. So without trying to complicate the messaging, I took the lead of that bass line and kind of repeated that saying over and over again. And the only thing that is added on to that narrative is kind of adding more to the storyline of Ile, like this song is everywhere, but we are living for it. This healing is everywhere and we are living for it. And it was just such a beautiful, beautiful collaboration. And there was a whole idea once we had written most of the song to have someone collaborate on it to kind of add a different flavor and a different element. And Banda had thought up of Dubatsi Mpho of Urban Village to, you know, put in his sound and his beauty, and he contributed so beautifully. He added some beautiful hooks ingoma lena, ingoma lena, ingoma lena, ingoma ilena. Like he added beautiful hooks. He added the African horn at the top of the track, and he added the mbira that he played. So he added just such a beautiful texture that kind of made the song. It gave the song so much more life. And yeah, that's Lengoma. That's Lengoma.
I love that song. And you know, for people who, again,
Thank you.
Speaking, when you say it's the song and it's the healing, are you referring to Ingoma, the song, and Ubungoma, healers?
Yes, yes,
Awesome.
yes, absolutely.
You know, before we played the song, I was telling you that I love that this album is not just about melancholy. It's not sad. It's not, you know, in a negative vibration, because this particular song sounds extremely joyful, and so joyful that it makes me think of, you know, Ghanaian and Nigerian high life, like just West African high life music.
Yes.
Like that. And I love that you were talking about adding the horn on top of that, because it feels like this high life groove with Kwaito lyrics.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting. And even just on the topic of having that Western African influence, we do have Ire Bolaji, who plays drums on that and kind of contributes to that Western African influence, because he's my Nigerian brother in the band. So he was also just playing within his element. And we have Samba Ndok Mbaye, who was a percussionist, also featured in the song. And he's a Senegalese brother. So those Western African flavors that you hear are definitely present as a way to kind of further the message of the song, you know. So I'm happy that comes through.
Yeah, no, I was definitely dancing my butt off, and I was like, this is so Kwaito, it's so South African, it's so West African, it's just like everything that I love. And, you know, the visual of this song, the video that you put out, is essentially you walking through nature, coming across these two beings, and in between them is this mirror where it looks like you're seeing yourself for the first time. But there's also this woman who comes to dance with you, who mirrors all your actions.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about what message you were trying to send with the visual?
So with the visual, it was an idea I had of just the idea of voyage, and the voyage of oneself, you know, very much like the album is centered around identity. That identity is a journey, you know, and there's a few destinations that happen within that, but it's this ongoing journey of just looking in. And at some point, my character in the video looks up and sees a mountain, you know, and kind of feels called to walk towards that particular mountain. And as this character is walking up into the mountain, they see the two figures, and then they see, I would say, almost like a godlike version of themselves dancing, and being the true essence of themselves. So I look into the mirror, and when I look into the mirror, I see this dancer that was danced beautifully, and the choreography was done beautifully by Ululu Mlangeni, who's just so spectacular. So I'm looking into the mirror, I'm seeing that, and I'm seeing it as the highest version of myself. So one would then say, I suppose, or my way of translating the message is that Ululu Mlangeni was playing the higher power, spirit, knowledge of myself, and then that was something for me to emulate, in order to have us then at some point towards the end of the video climbing further onto the mountain, you know. So it's kind of to speak of the destination of looking into oneself and wanting to emulate from seeing people that carry the truth that you're looking for, but knowing that even with that will just allow you to be equipped to climb the mountain to a higher height. But it's not a destination, it's just a realization of something that you can continue using as you go into your journey, you know. But I'm always interested to hear how other people like interpret the video and how they what truths, what is true to them in that. But yeah, I would say in a nutshell, that's what we were trying to accomplish with that,
Yeah.
just the idea of finding and voyage and the never endingness of it and the discovery of it. And yeah.
Yeah, I love that explanation because for me, I took away the reflection bit, right? And I love that you're explaining about the higher power because it seems like that's a big part of this album, like with songs like Abantu and even Abo Lolozelo and Isegazini. It feels like it's about more than what one can see. It's about more than the physical. Is that like a fair assessment?
Yes, I would definitely say that. There's this way or these philosophies that go into, and I respect them a great deal. These philosophies that go into our higher selves being found externally. And I've realized in my personal journey right now that our higher selves are something that we find internally, and I think even as a people, as Black people, when we look into ourselves, as much as we're not monoliths, and we don't have one way of looking or relating with our experiences, I think more than anything, just encouraging us to look into ourselves to see that higher power. Because I think we're very spiritual people, and a lot of our spirituality has been misguided and manipulated by a lot of religious leaders. And I think really just the messaging of us being able to look into ourselves as kindly and as gently as we can, and realizing that we can find a lot of truths in that way, being able to engage, being inquisitive about ourselves, and looking into ourselves and having those questions that we're often told not to ask. And just engaging with that truth. I think any space that discourages people to do that needs to be thoroughly looked into. I think we would find a lot of the beauty that we are in that kind of way. And we'd realize that we are godlike in that way. And obviously we all believe in different things. Other people don't believe that there is a higher power. But for me personally, my idea of us as a people is that we are made from a higher power that is much bigger than our own. And when we look into ourselves, we engage with the higher truth of ourselves. And in fact, the higher power is always waiting for us to see ourselves in their likeness, and to see ourselves in that bigness and that beauty, and engage those truths and interact and be familiar with those truths. So the higher power for me is an important part of what that is and what that looks like.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect segue to get into Umdali. That is another single from the album Inganekwane. So we're going to play a little bit of Umdali right now, and then we'll come back and talk to Zoe a little bit more about the song. And now we're going to talk about my favorite song.
I'm excited to know which one it is.
It's Umdali. So.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Yeah. No, I'm gonna try to not be too deep about it because you're still watching the Feel Good series listening party, and that was Zoë Modiga's song Umdali, which is off her latest album Inganekwane. Zoe,
yes,
on this particular song, this beautiful song, I don't even want to project my own things yet. I want to know where this song came from.
What's always so interesting about some of these particular conversations that we have is that whole concept of the genesis of the ideas and everything. And I know for different people it's different things. But for me, it always feels like I'm looking at it from like in hindsight, like, oh, this is what I take from it. So it's almost as though after it being created, I create my own perspective of what it is. And I just feel that it kind of comes to me, it's deposited to me, and then I experience it similarly to everyone else. And what I mean by that is that when I'm in my writing process, it's not necessarily the most intentional process. When I'm too intentional, it's usually things that I can't, or I myself don't necessarily find to share. It's usually things that come to me, and then once I've established the common thread, I'm able to organize it. But I don't have as much control over the genesis of it. But I think with Umdali, when I look back and listen to the words myself, it just creates this idea of this creator creating in his image and creating in his likeness, almost to acknowledge how godlike we are as a people, you know. And then at some point in the song, it goes into not just me, the listener, being created, but those that came before me, realizing that they were created by that same God, you know. And I suppose it's in some way, just I'm saying this from the top of my head, I think in some way it's almost also acknowledging even the way that like our ancestry gets to be demonized, that we are made in a godlike way, and those that came before us were made in that same godlike way. So why is that something to demonize, you know? And then it just goes into how the people that came before us had dreams and purposes and things that they were meant to establish in this life, and them passing the baton on to us and having asked for us as we are today, as we are alive and present today, and having asked for us to heed the call to ourselves as well, because there are dreams and hopes that still need to be established even in this moment. You know, I wonder if my interpretation of it is going to change the next time I'm asked this question, but I would say that's what it is right now.
Yeah, I love that that you have to put yourself in our shoes and go, you know, like what? I love that. But for me, this particular song, I think when your album came out, the day that it came out, like, I think I listened to this song maybe 3 times. Like, I couldn't move on to the next songs, you know? And like, it resonated deeply with me because I feel like whatever you believe to have created you, whether it's a him or a her or they or whatever, what you put into your song is that they created you in their image. They created you because they loved you, you know? And one of the things that stood out for me, and this is also just how you use your voice, because you say, amaphupho akudala sizowafeza kanjani, right? And that basically means, how are we going to realize the dreams from way back, right? Am I understanding that correctly? And
sure, yeah.
But that's in the beginning of the song. So then I was thinking, you know, as a grown-up, especially in these particular times, everyone had such plans for 2020. Everyone had dreams of what we're going to be in the future. And now it's like, how are we going to realize those dreams? In that, but there's also this idea of, like you were saying, the people who came before us. And particularly you singing Bayasidinga, Basiteng. And the way you sing it is like your voice kind of, I don't want to say thins out, but it's a different type of voice from how you started the song. And I was to talk to you about that as a device, because it feels to me like not even desperation, but it's you second guessing yourself, like, these people need us. We need to do this. How are we going to do this? So is it something that you resonate with? And like also tell me about using your voice as a device to convey those different emotions.
Wow, that is such a beautiful way of looking at it as well, you know. But that's such a beautiful question. The message is at the forefront of the whole thing, you know. And I think for me, the idea of being so special that I am a part of a people that have asked for me to be there. You know, they've asked for me to hold my space, and they have done their part in that. And my job is to look into myself to be able to get or grab the baton that, you know, they are giving me in order to be able to make these things happen. It feels like such a special thing to be seen in that way and to be interacted with in that way, where I didn't just arrive into the planet and existed, but it was on purpose that I was here, you know. It feels beautiful to me, and it feels like there is a reason, and there is something that I can identify to, you know. And I think as people, a part of our journeys is to identify with certain things in order to make our purposes true to ourselves. You know, we call each other or ourselves very many names, and I'm not just talking about bad things, but we identify as so many different things, as a sense of belonging to something and being seen with what we've identified ourselves as. And so for me, the idea of being a Black body and being able to look back and identify with something that wants me to be here is such a special thing. And it feels like a warm hug. It feels like a realization. And I think realizations feel like a heavenly thing. And maybe then that's why my voice goes higher in that part, because it's that feeling of just being elevated, you know. I don't use my, I'm not very strategic when it comes to how I relay a particular thing. But I just listen to what the messaging is. So the messaging is always at the forefront of that. And maybe my voice just took the lead in that and realized that maybe the statement to be made there is the idea of being elevated, and how that feels otherworldly, and it feels like this floating existence of something. And maybe that's why I sing up there, you know. But wow, that's a beautiful question. I'll have to look into that and really.
You must tell me once you've thought about it some more.
I will. I think
Yeah.
that's a very interesting question. But I think more than anything, it's also like the idea of like interacting with truths and knowing that you are not necessarily leading that idea. You are just interacting with it, and maybe the way that the truth moves is maybe then my voice moving to it, you know. So I'm not saying, okay, in this part I would like to just use my voice as a device and make it sound like this, but I'm just feeling that natural movement of the message, and maybe it's that.
Yeah, I love it. But like truly a transformative song. So like well done, even if you hadn't intended. You just download the song. But another thing that I find even more special about this song, and I think it shows up on the album pretty much everywhere except Black Butterfly, I believe, is you singing the song in your mother tongue creates an even more intentional intimacy, you know? And I'm talking about Umdali in particular. And I wanted to figure out, like, as a young person, because you're in your 20s, right?
Yes.
I'm in my 30s, and every day I feel like I'm butchering all the tongues of my mothers and fathers and right? And I want to know, so for you, especially because you grew up in different places, like you said, how easy or difficult is it for you to write ngesiZulu?
Beautiful. Like, these questions, Helen, are just so incredibly beautiful. And really, I think with this album, it's kind of a testament to that. I think there's a lot of parallels we can draw even amongst ourselves. You being in your 30s and me being heading towards my late 20s is exactly the feeling of not feeling like I have over language, and song in Yellow the Novel, I was in some kind of way, without even knowing that I was, as much as it relayed an emotion in the most honest way that it could have, because it was my language, I may have been dismissive about what impact it could possibly have by mere fact that it was written in my language and not in English like the rest of the songs. And I think once I started having conversations with so many beautiful people that affirmed what that was, it kind of was part of the switch in my mind of like, geez, there's something important about being born the way that I've been and having to move around the world in the way that I have, how much of a blessing that is. But just how fuzzy the idea of identity and language is. I feel in many ways I would play myself down. I know we're global citizens as people, but I think I play my insecurities about relaying in my language that way, that no, we're just global citizens.
Yeah.
And then when I looked into myself, I realized that like there's so many push and pulls in the relationship with language that I've had from the very beginning. When I went to school, there was this whole thing of being told that I was rude because I was speaking in isiZulu. And it was at a time when I was a lot more fluent in it because I was living in KwaZulu-Natal, and I relocated to Gauteng and interact with other beautiful Nguni languages. But having had less time to kind of practice my own language, there's a sense of loss in that. And then just as a Black body, having to assimilate to the Western world and the way that we should be moving around, and trying to find ourselves in that becomes an important part even of my journey, having to walk the walk and talk the talk to enter certain spaces and to sit on certain tables. And I suppose then in the way that Solange says, there's a seat in her table, in her body of work, it's kind of drawing that whole thing of realizing to just make your own table. And that I felt from all these conversations and all these musicians I was listening to, Abo Mambu Simhlongo, Abo Salif Keita, Rokia Chahore, Fatomata Diawara, all these people, some of them I was speaking languages I didn't understand intellectually, but they spoke to something that I completely understood. And I think that gave me a safe space, in knowing that I don't have all the big words, I don't have all the big metaphors, I don't have the fluency that I'd like. There are certain Zulu channels and spaces and stations where I literally, like, my heart beats faster. Like I get nervous being called into those spaces because I don't feel I belong, But I think this album and this process has allowed me to have that safe space to exist, and knowing that so many people will relate to my particular narrative, because it's not that of being raised in the most traditional kind of way, but still being able to communicate in my language, to kind of claim ownership to it, but realizing that there's so many things even in language that are coded that a lot of Black bodies are going to be able to understand, I feel, regardless of where they are in the world. And just respecting and being humble to the power of that, more than allowing my own insecurities about what my journey is. And also relating to people who relate to my journey and my insecurities and my particular way in which I've moved in the world, and saying that this is a real thing too. Because I think even back home, there'll always be this thing of like, why aren't you fluent in this particular language? Or why aren't you, there's a lot of why aren't yous. And it's those conversations about like, well, I was given opportunities that were meant to create space for me, but a lot of other fuzzy things were happening in those processes. And that's who I am now, but I'm still very proud of who I am and what that means to me.
Yeah.
And I suppose then that's me just owning that up and being kind to that, and realizing that I'm still very much a student, and I'm not like this literal Zulu literature queen or whatever, you know what I mean? But just being confident in my story being enough, and knowing that it will relate to a lot of different kinds of people in very many different ways. So yeah, that language thing is very interesting. But I think the idea of owning it is also beautiful, and what that looks like to me and other people, you know.
Yeah. And we're here now, you know. Sila, sila.
Yes.
So before I let you go, right? You start this album like folklore and fairy tale start, you know, with the Once Upon a Time, and you end it with the Gos Pelile. So I'm interested in the journey that you're walking in your life and in your music. Let's look 90 years from now, right? 70, 80, 90 years from now. When we say Gos Pelile on your life, what is the one thing you want to have achieved?
The one thing or something that I would like to achieve is just kind of the humanizing of my personal story, the parts that I'm willing to share, that is, but the humanizing of my personal stories, and kind of relating the human experience back to people, whilst me myself being humanized, you know, and being seen as a human being who had her strengths and her weaknesses, who had her flaws, and who had the things that people loved and looked up to, and just someone who really stood for something that they considered was their truth, and knowing that that could possibly relate to a lot of people who agree with that, you know, someone who evoked emotion, someone who was in some way impactful and influential, and did that responsibly through the conversations that we're able to have because of the messages that this music has. Just someone who really, more than anything, I suppose, feels for people and feels with people, and having that be at the epicenter of everything. You know, I feel for people, and I'm for what we are, and I think us being here as human beings is such. Different people relate to why they're here, but I think it's a choice we've made, but it's also the need for us to be here is just such a prevalent thing to me, and it's something I've had to meditate within myself, because I didn't think that was always a thing or a reality, you know. I feel like I'm rambling, but I think, yeah, just to reflect people's lives back to them from a place of empathy, and a place of being like, well, you know, we're all human too, and that means so many layered and complex things, but let's look into what that is and celebrate and engage it, you know. And maybe when I go into my next life, if I'm exposed to this one, I'd like to see what it all meant, you know, because I can want all these things, but I don't know what it's going to look like. You know, I can just do what I feel is my personal truth, and what I feel I'm led to do, and the causes I feel I was dedicated to in my lifetime, you know. But I'm excited to see if I'm going to be exposed to that, you know, what it all meant.
I love that. And I have no doubt that that's on the cards for you. So Zoe, thank you so much for hanging out with us on the Feel Good series listening party. I can't wait to see you in real life, but I know you're doing big things online, so everyone can still catch up with you on the socials, and more importantly, they can still buy and stream your album on their preferred streaming service, yeah?
Absolutely. And I'd love to interact with everyone on my social media as well. I'm really enjoying the DMs and the tweets and everything, and I'd just like us to continue to engage with the body of work, but just also, you know, as people. So let's keep in contact.
Lovely. Well, I'm Helen Herimbi.
And I'm Zoë Modiga.
And this has been the Feel Good series listening party. We'll catch you next time.